coming out. Appreciate you coming. Before we get started, I want to get everybody to, before you leave tonight, meet Zach Morgan, right? Zach is new in town. His wife's a teacher at Shelby County High, and Zach's very interested in history, and we need to recruit him. Tonight we have Fred Rogers, who is a historic district coordinator. Has been a couple of years now. He's a great drummer. I thought I was pretty good. Wow. He's really good. So I just want to talk about the historic district.
All right. Well, thank you. Okay. Well, I would have much rather talked about drumming. I really appreciate that. And can you all hear me okay? If I step over here, can you hear me okay? You see much difference? Okay. I may or may not be in front of this. I wander around a bit. So, again, well, thank you for coming out. And I really appreciate the Historical Society. I have had a chance to get up close with everybody, kind of get to know a lot of people. And then there's those that I don't know who I would enjoy meeting whenever the occasion is right. And so I think the Historical Society, I'll just give it a plug, is great. And I've actually had people come in my office and I try to get them to join. That's true. And I think a gentleman back here came in and I gave him an application. He's the one I recognized early on, and he did join. So amen to that. And I think he's a retired history teacher, correct? So anyway, yes. I'm the Historic District Coordinator, as you know. I hope you know. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as I go forward, because it's an interesting subject. And I'll tell you how it's interesting as we go. And I really appreciate having worked here now for a couple of years. It's been a quick 2 years for me. And in those 2 years, it's been mostly observations, right? I get to observe a lot. And from those observations, I get to learn a lot. And mostly, I learn what not to do, right? So that I can keep my skin. So as I was planning for this talk here, I kind of planned for a short talk. And I would also invite this talk open to you. If we're going along and you want to interject or something like that, I imagine that most of you all have a lot of wisdom about the topic of historic preservation, architecture, the community, history, etc. And I would really love to hear your views. And so feel free if you want to chime in. And as you can see, I titled my talk here, I was trying to get clever, right, with like 3 P's or whatever. Preservation, or I'm sorry, perception, planning, and the third P, which I hope is obvious to you. Do you know what it is? See how ridiculous? Just doesn't that make sense? Yes? Well, good. You're not going to believe how much I struggled to come up with a third P for this thing. You know. Anyway, there it was. The obvious elephant in the room. And so I've put a little emphasis on this notion of preservation, because that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. And I certainly won't cover what all that means tonight, but we'll hit on it a little bit. And I, again, like to hear your views on it. In particular, the ways in which we think about historic preservation today. All right? This idea has been with us for a while. If you travel overseas, you can see that it's been with other cultures and civilizations for a really long time. And preservation, there's just something in us, I think, that says, well, hey, let's preserve this thing, whatever it is, and then we will assign value to it, we'll assign meaning to it, and from there we'll say it's worth something to us, right? And I'm sure all of you probably feel that way about your community to some extent. It means something to you, yes? And that's why you feel it's worth preserving, as do I. So let's just launch into this. The first piece of this is perceptions. Right? This is an interesting thing. Our perceptions guide us. And sometimes they guide us in the wrong ways. And we have to imagine then, well, how do we correct our perception? Or can we? And sometimes we can, and sometimes we can't, right? And right out of the gate, the first perception in this job is the job title itself. And some of you that's been around me has heard me kind of struggle with this a little bit, right? And James, admittedly, right before we all started talking here, he's like, now what is it again? The historic, right? And so I've been called everything. People introduce me. Here's the historic president, of the Historical Society. Roger, no offense. And I'm like, yep. What do I say? Here's one that's just amazing. And these, by the way, these are common. I mean, these are the common ones. There's others, right? Where people their perception of what I do or who I am is really skewed. The history guys, anybody ever seen him? Yeah, George Sukanopoulos. Great guy. Anyway, I love Ancient Aliens. So, nevertheless, and then here's the real one. When people just don't know what to say, right? I'm aren't you the new Gale? I don't know what they're seeing. And you're bound to see this one coming, right? Because people will dig way down in their pocket to pull this one out. And they get so excited that they realized that my name was his name. Right? This happens constantly. In fact, Shelbyville, I imagine that everybody in Shelbyville watched this show because nobody seems to miss it. Oh, aren't you Mr. Rogers? Yeah. Old technology comes back alive. Another history victory. That's right. Do you ever feel jinxed? Anyway, welcome to these folks here. I guess everybody knows who they are. If not, you should meet these folks after this is over. Glad you made it. Thank you to the technology crew, the ER staff that revived us here. So if we're going to do a review, what would we say, right? We're talking about perception, yes, and I've laid out for you, I hope, something of a case where I think that there is a 2 years of me now observing a perception problem. And so that's what I'm building my case around here, and hopefully the computer will continue to cooperate. And I said that we cannot thrive in an environment where the word can't is the thing that we hang all of our action on. Yes? And we know then, as I was saying, that this is a perception problem for me. And then I, before this thing crashed, was going to take you to this slide right here where I remembered this quote. And see, this will make more sense to you now. We ain't allowed to do nothing, are we? Right? Now, how many of you want to have a historic district where that's the rule of thumb? No? Okay, no brainer. But would you imagine then that would make my job tough? Right? To have to deal with people whose perceptions are tied up into a bundle of things that I have to go in there and kind of unravel before I can effectively communicate with them. You see this? And so in these 2 years, I've done that. I've tried to do that a bunch of times in a bunch of different ways. Debbie, I know you got to leave. Has Sherry left? Debbie's gone. Debbie has left the building. But here's the one that's really the kicker for me, and this is the one that I would say I take a little bit more to heart, right? If you go into the Historic District office, it's going to be an unpleasant experience. Who wants that for their office? Who wants that for their job here? Carrie, if I come to your office, you want me to leave and go, man, that was the most unpleasant experience. Nobody wants that, right? And it's a lot of that is just based on this perception that I'm talking about, right? And what I need to do, and have been trying to do, yes, Let's have some happy babies. Let's turn the lemons into lemonade. Every day, this is what I feel like I need to try to do, and I'm going to continue trying to do that. Yes, and to try to get around this issue of perception. Stare at that thing for a minute. Is that doing what it's supposed to do? Have you seen these little brain teaser things before? Yes, and that's all about perception, right? And so what I'm being asked to do then, every day, is straighten that out. Okay? So if there's anybody out here that prays, right? You have a prayer list at church or whatever, put Fred on it. Right? Just don't even hesitate. Okay? I'm all for it. So, in the myriad of possibilities, every day that I go to work, right, I'm faced with, well, what am I going to do here, right? Because believe me, even just this week, I've been confronted. You know, I never say much about it to anybody. I just keep it to myself. But I think we need to get back to the basics, right? And so let's talk about that a little bit. What are the basics, for example? You know, what is historic preservation to begin with? What is it? And that goes back to this issue that I said at the start, today, right? Because if I take you back in time, it's going to look different. Things about it would be different. And if I move you through time, you would see things changed over time to get to the point where we are today. And that's kind of what I want to talk about a little bit with this, right? If I was to ask each of you, what is historic preservation, what would you say?
Preserving a life.
What?
Preserving a life. Preserving
a life. You know I was going to put you on the spot, did you? I told you I would. Nothing? You have to think about it? Anybody want to volunteer and answer?
Preserving like it was.
We'll say again?
Say it, just put it back like it was.
I think this is a good challenge. Wouldn't you say? That we have something in us that says what this might be, but now I want you to tell me what it is. See how that became a challenge? It's not that you can't, you just have to think about it. Carrie?
Figure out what has made us as a community and try to preserve that aspect of it.
Yes. One might say it's heritage. It could be architecture. It could be landscapes. It can be culture. It can be race. It can be a lot of things. All balled up into this complicated thing we call history. Right? So if I'm the history guy, right, what do I tell people about it? Well, it's very hard to unravel this in a way that people can fully understand it. And it's also a thing that I would say not everybody has the same sense of value for. And that's a whole other talk I could give on this subject, is how do we value this thing we call historic preservation. But you can see then, with this is a pretty informed audience. I already know that. And in this informed audience, we still see how we struggle. Right? Imagine people who aren't informed about this. How much then this becomes that much more foggy, right? So when you hire your historic preservation coordinator, right, you got to be thinking about, well, can this guy do this job? All right, and hopefully I can. So I told you I would take you back a little bit and look at historic preservation from the standpoint of what it used to be. And it still is. It hasn't fully left this model. But how many of you were around when the historic preservation movement started? Quite a few of you. So in some sense of the word, we say, well, it's a pretty young thing in American history. It's certainly not a young thing in world history.
We are
right?
really young.
Huh?
We're really young. We were really young.
In fact, some of you in here, it was your generation that hatched this egg, all right, that brought this into being. And thank you, because I have a job today because of this, right? And an education and so on. But you can see that this really did form out of a reactionary impulse among many in the country who saw a country that was turning in on itself in a lot of different ways. And one of those ways was urban renewal. Other ways were unregulated pollution standards, unregulated other issues that led then to a whole lot of regulatory acts within Congress that became laws, mostly environmental laws. And in fact, all of the laws that govern historic preservation live under the umbrella of NEPA, if you know what that is, the National Environmental Protection Agency, right? So if you want to look at and study historic preservation law, that's the codes you go look at. So it lives directly in the environmental laws today. Well, that's cool. This was a movement then that said what matters in the bigger picture is conservation. And as a result, people who practice historic preservation were practicing a really refined form of material conservation. They were trying to say that these bricks matter, this mortar matters, this form matters, this building matters, and you can build it out from there, right? And that led to what I call a fetishizing over the materials of the building. And I don't mind saying it that way because a lot of times that's what stymies our progress in historic preservation, is that we place a lot of value on the materials. And that is obviously important, more important in some cases than other. And that's why we have a Historic District Commission that has to value those judgments, to say, is that thing important enough to have to preserve it, or can we change it, right? And you know that's a tricky thing to have to deal with. As you can probably guess by my age, I was born in '62. This was all happening when I was watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So I missed this for the most part. So what happened? Well, as the 60s gave way to the 70s, then you have a whole other movement that had already taken place in America. It's the documentary impulse. If this was my history class I'm teaching, we would have talked about this, in particular during the Great Depression, when there just seemed to be some interest using photography and other means of documentation to record the agony and plight of, say, the Dust Bowl, or the agony and plight of the Great Depression. And this created in Americans, in particular in the popular media and other kinds of press, what is referred to as the documentary impulse. We like to document ourselves. All right? You watch a History Channel, you watch any, you can catch documentaries all over the place. Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, that's right. This is being documented as we speak. This is an old Ansel Adams photograph. If anybody knows who that was, one of the most celebrated black and white photographers ever, one of the most celebrated photographers ever. This spills over then into the 1970s, and by the way, none of these impulses have gone away. We still do this. The 1970s ushered in yet another reactionary impulse among historic preservationists, in particular professional architects who practice historic preservation, and that was the documentary impulse toward looking at and preserving buildings through drawings. And we get from that the Historic American Building Survey. And there's an engineering survey, so that if you go to the Library of Congress today, you can file through, I don't know how many. Have you ever done that, Bob? It's an amazing collection of documented buildings.
Some buildings from federal buildings.
Have you?
They were going to get torn down.
Yep.
Had to document.
Well,
Building and architectural.
HABs had already been around. HABs came to us through the Depression era when they put out-of-work architects into work by documenting buildings. So if you go there, the collection comes through the 1930s. But that, again, it gets born again in the 70s, and most preservationists will train to be documentation specialists of some kind, either as architects or as less professionally trained, where you'll just do field work. So what are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about historic